Hi, I'm George with Nordhaus. Welcome to Monday morning. And this is for you brainiacs out there who deal with workers' compensation insurance. And I know there's a lot of because every agency that I know, does that. But when I was talking to Frank Pennachio, I've talked to him. He's done others of these for us, and there'll be more in the future because he's the pro workers' comp guy that we go to. He said, there's a heck of a lot of agencies out there that are really overlooking tremendous accounts. What do you mean, Frank? Well, and I don't give you talk for him, but when he did that to me, all of a sudden the light dawned. I said, oh my God, we got to get something in the hands of these people for that they can go out and really hit an account hard and make it happen to you because that's what my job is here anyway. So let me tell you about Frank just a minute. Here's his picture. We're coming up in just a second here. Here we go. And he was an agent for a long, long time. Well, why don't you tell us, Frank? You started in the 80s, right?
Sure, George. Late 80s came in with Federated, to direct writers. Some of your listeners likely have bumped into them or maybe even be a former Fed head, as we used to call ourselves. And then in the early to mid 90s, launched my own agency, hung out my own shingle, and did that for about 25 years or so.
Wow.
Sold the agency and strictly doing consulting and training with agents and carriers full time now. So I like to say, George, I'm a recovering insurance agent. It's a great profession, and I really enjoy working with agents and carriers around the country.
Well, you've got a reputation all over the country as the guy to go to for workers' comp, and that's what I appreciate you taking the time. Let's talk about what I introduced and what you told me about. Your move.
Yes, George. The objectives is large accounts, large work comp accounts, and I'm going to go through these erroneous assumptions where I'll talk a little bit about our survey too, but agents just seem to feel like they don't belong in the large account space, that the large accounts are left for the national and regional brokers, that they don't belong there. Well, one of the objectives today is to take on those erroneous assumptions, talk about loss-sensitive plans, and really talk about how they can get involved and why there's opportunity in that large account, large deductible workers' compensation. And we're going to walk them through, George, a different process. We're calling it the large deductible assessment process, where we're going to use analytics. We're going to talk about how to negotiate the most effective claims administration contracts, because there's typically unbundled claims administration costs and processes on these accounts. And then, of course, evaluate the businesses, their own practices with respect to preventing injuries and then managing them after they occur.
Let me ask you a question, Frank. What do you say?
Yes, sir.
A large account? Large account to a guy out in the sticks could be $10,000 a year or something. What do you mean by a large account?
Yeah, let me define that. Let's define that term. For this purpose, for the purpose of this conversation, we're going to say it's greater than $500,000 in premium on the work comp. Now, some folks may say, I can't go there. Well, the survey that we did with our agents, both clients and prospective clients, is the vast majority of agents know that they can get in on some of these accounts, but they just don't know what to do or don't feel confident. Let me put it that way. They don't feel comfortable and confident as to how they can compete with perhaps the larger national and regional agencies. Now, of course, we always have to put the caveat out there. There's always exceptions. I'm sure there's agents and agencies out there that are not necessarily among the largest in the country and doing a fine job here. But let me share this story with you. A very, very close friend of mine, 2 years ago, traveled the country every single week doing nothing but talking to agents, small, medium, and large agents, and talking about this very topic, especially around using analytics, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, using analytics for large accounts. The incumbent agents, the agents that had the account, said, I really don't want to go there because I'm afraid my client's going to say, well, why haven't you brought me this information before? You've been my agent for 5, 10, or 15 years. How come all of a sudden you're bringing an analytical approach? So incumbents know that they're likely to renew the account if they just, deliver a good renewal and just kind of, do their thing. People tend not to move around too much when everything's just kind of rocking along. The non-incumbent agents are not comfortable having an analytical conversation. They don't know how to have that conversation. So what happens is this, George, the incumbents continue to renew the accounts, not because they're necessarily, doing the most extraordinary job, being out on the cutting edge, using analytics and other processes to improve the employer's outcomes, but because, they're in place and nothing bad has gone wrong, so they continue on. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I understand exactly. What do you mean by loss sensitive then down there?
Yes, loss sensitive, this is where it's going to be one of two different types of risks. It's going to be, we'll take on these assumptions in a moment, it's going to be either a retrospective rating plan or a large deductible, where the employer has loss sensitivity whereby they're going to pay a portion of their claims. Mm-hmm. So if they're guaranteed costs, that's we're not going to have as much oomph in that, but typically you don't typically see guaranteed cost on accounts of this size unless they have so many problems that they're just happy to have a guaranteed cost policy, and we'll talk about that in a few moments as well. But let's take on some of these, what I like to call the erroneous assumptions, what agents often think and feel about this space, and how they maybe feel like, I don't belong there. Well, as mentioned, they often feel that it's the exclusive domain of the large national and regional brokers. And by no means are we critical of the large national and regional brokers. They have a lot of horsepower, they have a lot of talent, they have a lot of intellectual capital, they have a lot of resources. But we're asserting it should not be their exclusive domain. We're not saying they don't belong there, we're just saying it should not be their exclusive domain. And if an agent gets their arms around the things we're going to talk about today, George, they're going to be able to compete head-to-head. I promise them that. They often feel, I don't have the capabilities or the resources to compete. You can get those capabilities very, I won't say easily, but you can get up to speed. You can compete. And we'll talk about areas in which when an agency gets their arms around certain capabilities and have, certain resources, they can compete with anybody in the marketplace. So let's dispense with the assumption that I can't compete with the big folks, the big nationals and regionals. The other one, and this is often very interesting, well, a large account that has $500,000 in work comp premium up, and I've had, accounts come across my desk in coaching and mentoring and training agents over the past month or two, especially around 1/1, they were $1 million, $1.5 million, $2.5 million, $3 million accounts that I was coaching them through. And George, I can assert to you without any equivocation whatsoever, employers of this size need help. The assumption is, well, they're big, they have a lot at risk, they must have very sophisticated risk managers, very sophisticated CFOs, and I'm not going to say that there's not some out there, but I will say this, the vast majority of the folks that have been charged with multi-million-dollar responsibilities are not as sophisticated as agents often think they are and don't have the time, talent, or resources to do the job that needs to be done, and they need the help of the agent and the agency.
Well, that's a great point. That's beautiful. Now, I'd be frightened.
Regardless of size.
I'd be frightened going to $100 million account or $10 million account. I'd be frightened if I were in a small agency. God, but you're so right about this.
You would think so, but they need help, and sometimes there's a little more politics involved, but they need help. Please don't assume, agents, that large account it all together and they have very sophisticated folks on board. I'm not going to say that none do, but I'm going to say the vast majority are not at the level that agents assume they are.
I got you.
Another assumption. We think that their existing risk management processes are already wired tight, that they're effective and they're efficient. That's not the case either. You conduct an effective assessment of their processes, you're going to find that they're doing some things very well. You're going to find some things that are completely off their radar screen that they haven't considered, let alone addressing. So all of these assumptions tend to keep them wrong. They're just wrong. And they tend to intimidate the agent, say, well, I don't belong in that large account. I don't have anything to bring them, and everything's probably already taken care of and buttoned up because they're large and they have a lot of resources and they have the big national or regionals helping them. I'm just going to ask people, George, that are listening to this to take a leap of faith for the duration of this presentation, set that aside, and see if we can inspire them to dispense with that thinking and get in this game, because I will assert this unequivocally. There's not only opportunity, there's a need. There is a strong need for agents to get in here and to work with these larger accounts. Now, there's typically, you're going to see in these larger accounts, two different types of plans. You're going to see either a large deductible plan or a retrospective rating plan. For our purposes today, we're going to talk about large deductible, because that's the most common when you get above $500,000 in premium. And it's a very simple structure. We're not going to spend a lot of time, but deductible programs are very simple. You pay the carrier a deductible premium, a premium just like you're paying a guaranteed cost, only it's significantly reduced because you're going to pay the claims up to that deductible amount. We'll talk more about that in a moment. You're going to also pay for claims handling expenses. Those are unbundled on these types of plans. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. You pay the premium and all the different assessments and taxes, and then you pay your claims. So those you add all those things up, those are your total cost, and then you have an option to have an aggregate stop loss. So, you know, when we go down to the next example here, what you'll see is, in our example, we're going to show both a specific deductible of $250,000 per claim, and in this particular example, the aggregate stop loss for the policy period is $1.5 million. So in the chart that we just showed, or the flow chart, pay the premium, pay the $250,000 per claim. When you hit $1.5 million in claims cost, separate and apart from the premium, and separate and apart from the claims expense, depends on how it's handled, typically is bundled in, $1.5 million plus the deductible premium, boom, if you fund an aggregate stop loss, that's your max out-of-pocket cost for the year. Some employers have such credible data that they don't even buy an aggregate. They don't feel that they have a big enough risk. Most people do buy an aggregate stop loss. So this is the typical plan that we see, George. Any questions or thoughts around that?
If you're asking me, I'm learning more about workers' compensation since I talked to you than I've known in all these years. So what can I say about that hasn't been already said, huh? I know, yeah, I'm learning. Just keep going.
We'll keep moving along.
All right.
Now, this next slide, when you look at this, George, your brain just may want to go, I don't even want to deal with that. There's too much information on that. There's too much data. And we're not going to go through it point by point. But I want your listeners to look at this and understand the following. This is the typical way an agent lays out options of deductible plans for decision makers. And as you'll see real quickly, and I'm not going to get buried in the minutia here because we'll lose people. But they often will do this. They'll lay this out in front of a CFO or risk manager, and they'll say, okay, here's carrier. Here's your first carrier. The deductible is $150,000 per claim. It has an aggregate of $2 million. The next option you have is a $250,000 per claim. Could be the same carrier. Could be a different carrier. I'll tell you why that matters in a moment. With an aggregate stop loss of $2.5 million. The asterisk means that the premium is the funding of the aggregate. And here's an option for you, a $500,000 per claim up to a $3 million aggregate. And you'll see that, you know, the rates are very different. Which one do you want, George? Which one do you want?
I love the challenge. I don't know.
And who does know? You know what happens? They lay this out. They go, which one do you want? And the person on the other side goes, well, what do you recommend? Well, I like the $250,000. Let's go with that one. Okay, if that's what you recommend, let's go. Now, as I mentioned, the purpose today is not to drill down into the minutia, but that's how typical large deductible plans are sold. Now, I'm gonna challenge that methodology here as we step forward. Okay, we're going to talk about a completely different process. We're going to talk about a large deductible assessment, where we're going to first use analytics. Then we're going to talk about negotiating a claims contract, which is so critical and often way overlooked. And then we're going to talk about business processes. You know, how the business actually operates to make sure that this transfer of risk mechanism, this funding mechanism, it has any chance of working out well because of the way the business is operating, how they're hiring, how they're training, how they're managing the safety, how they're managing return to work, and all of those kinds of things. So we've got analytics, negotiating not only the insurance contract, but probably even more importantly, the claims contract, and then the business processes. Little different than just laying down a spreadsheet with three options of different levels of deductibles and saying, take your pick. So we're going to open up with analytics. Now, first and foremost, George, a Ouija board is not an analytical tool, okay? And neither is a dartboard. So we're going to go at this a little bit differently, and we're not going to just take a mind reader or wild guess or Ouija board or dartboard to make decisions, because there are analytical questions that need to be addressed. We are, as agents, asking employers to literally take on risk over several years, because you typically don't go on these plans for 1 year. It's over several years that can stack up to be millions of dollars. And why would we want people to make those kinds of decisions without analytical support, with a spreadsheet that says here's 1 from column A and 2 from column B? So here's some questions that we want to get analytical support around. First is, what do we expect the loss pick is going to be? Now, loss pick is just simply an estimate of what the losses are going to be for that calendar year, for that policy year, for that policy year. We need to have a good understanding. And look, no disrespect to agents. I speak on behalf of being one for many, many years. And I work with agents, and I love working with agents. But I don't think I've met an agent yet who majored in math in college. We're not typically mathematicians, so we can't look at 5 years of loss runs and determine whether a large deductible is a good fit for that. We need actuaries and analysts to do that. We start with, what's the loss pick? Because just because an account is large, George, that doesn't mean they should be on a large deductible plan. That doesn't mean they should even be on a loss-sensitive plan. Yes, when you're a larger account, it opens that door to assess it. But if the loss pick is way too high, why would we want to put them on a large deductible plan if there's a carrier that will offer them a guaranteed cost plan? Maybe they have some work to do to get prepared to go on loss-sensitive. So let's just not assume that they belong on a large deductible because they're above $500,000 in premium. Fair statement?
Fair to me.
Okay. Next, we're going to want to know, well, which deductible should we choose using analytics based on what an actuary would indicate? Should it be that $150,000, that $250,000, that $500,000? We shouldn't just kind of spitball that by looking at a spreadsheet. Let's bring analytics to the table as to where that retention, that deductible level should be based on actuarial science. Then let's ask, should we fund for that aggregate stop loss? Most employers do, but you know what? Let's take a look at it through analytics. Maybe the likelihood is so slim that we would ever exceed what would typically be our aggregate stop loss that maybe we don't need to fund for it. Maybe we do. Let's take a look at it analytically. Then, and this is really important, George, collateral is going to have to be posted. Typically, letters of credit, are going to have to be posted. The carrier, has got to they have to put the money up for the deductible money, and then they have to get reimbursed up to the level of the deductible. In essence, carriers have a greater credit risk, meaning to collect the money they're owed when they pay the claims under the deductible limit. They have a greater credit risk frequently than they have an underwriting risk with large deductible plans. As a matter of fact, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners is looking at this right now because several carriers have gone bankrupt recently because they couldn't collect on their deductibles. It's a particular industry that's caused them that problems, but we're not going to talk about PEOs today. We're going to talk about other things. We'll take that on another day.
Yeah, you don't want to mention who it is, but I understand.
Yeah, we won't go down that path, but people can Google that topic, and there's some interesting information out there. So is the collateral equitable? Look, we carriers need to make sure they're going to get paid, and they need to make sure their credit risk is covered. But we also want to make sure that they're not overstating the case. We want it to be fair and equitable collateral. Both sides are protected. And can the balance sheet take the lick? Because the collateral is going to stack up year over year, and you start tying up a lot of collateral on your balance sheet. That could impede your growth down the road, especially if you have a bonding line or something like that. By golly, let's at least look into these issues before we move ahead and just make decisions off of spreadsheets and rates. Another question that we like to ask that we can look at analytically is, a lot of employers will say, we're doing pretty well. I think we got good claims experience. We're managing them well. We're getting people back to work. Well, you know what? Why don't we analytically look at that and see if your individual company's loss development factors, how your losses are developing over time, are you better or worse than like or similar businesses?
Mm-hmm.
We can get the comparison data, and let's see how you're doing. Are you better than the averages? If so, that bodes well to potentially encourage you to go on a large deductible. If you're worse than the averages, why? What's going on? What do we need? Maybe we need to address that before you consider a large deductible plan. And, you know, these claims go on for years, so the employer really does need to look at a cash flow analysis to see, okay, over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, what is my cash flow going to have to look like in order to fund the tail claims, meaning, you know, until all the claims are closed. So those are questions, George, that why would anybody want to go on a large deductible plan if they haven't answered those questions with analytical support without actuarial support?
Beats me. But
And
I
it
wonder if they
happens
all
every day.
I wonder if they realize it. I wonder if so. You're saying they're really not confronted with this, are they?
Typically not, because there's fear among a lot of agents. Now, everything I say has a caveat and exception, so let's just all stipulate that, George. There may be somebody that's listening going, I do that on every single case.
Yeah, okay.
Kudos to you.
Right.
But the flip side is, here's what I hear more times than not. Well, I've done hundreds of large deductibles, and I've never used analytics. Or I'm not comfortable bringing analytical assessments in at this stage of the game because I've had this client for 10 years, and they're going to wonder why I haven't done it before. Or I don't know how to talk about that. I don't know how to have that conversation. So, you know, my job is to just try to make sure I get the best deductible premium from the carrier and negotiate the collateral down as low as I can.
Got it.
George, these are actual conversations coming out of the actual mouths of agents.
I'm sure they are.
And it's no disrespect. It's absolutely no disrespect to say that. It's just the traditional way in which these situations have been addressed. And, of course, we see opportunity if agents want to go the other way. Fair enough?
I'm with you.
Okay, the next area we're going to talk about, this is rarely spoken of, George, is that whether it be a carrier or whether it be a third-party administrator, and again, let me say this, George, we don't believe that people get up out of bed in the morning and attempt to do anything other than a good job. We're in a great profession. I really believe people get up every day and they really try to do the best job they possibly can. Sometimes the processes in the system will beat them, and a bad process or a bad system will oftentimes beat a good person. But in no means, when I'm speaking of claims administration contracts, am I in any way inferring anything other than the best intentions of carriers and TPAs, third-party administrators. But yet we have complexity, we have misaligned incentives, and sometimes things need to be discussed openly and transparently. Otherwise, the best way we like to put it is incentives get out of alignment. And when the incentives are out of alignment, either the scale is going to be tipped too much in one way or the other. We want to make sure everybody has a fair and equitable way of paying for the claims administration services. Because virtually every claims administration contract that you'll find on these plans, George, has this clause in it. Claim fees do not include allocated loss adjustment expenses, which means we're going to tell you how much we're going to charge you for the fees. You may have even remembered back at that spreadsheet that I tried not to spend too much time on because I was afraid people's brains would shut down, that there was a fee. It was actually a loss conversion factor fee to handle claims. But that fee that was stated on that spreadsheet does not include allocated loss adjustment expenses. Now, these are important services, but let's talk about them. And I broke them down into three major categories. There's the medical management, there's the legal, and what typically ancillary is, George, a box where I didn't know what to put those other two things, so I'll call it ancillary. But third-party administrators and carriers must build and manage or lease a provider network. They have to do bill review. They have to do nurse case management, utilization, and peer review. They typically work with a pharmacy benefit management company. A lot of them are working with physical therapy networks. And I could probably go on, but that's plenty. Now, those are all very important services. The question is, how do you pay for them and what's fair? And I'm going to get to that in just a few moments. The same thing when you go to legal. Sure, you have to pay for investigation. Sure, you have to pay for litigation. And over on the ancillary side, you have to pay for transportation and transcription. So all these things are important. They're all valuable. They all need to be a part of the mix. But how do we align the incentives to make sure that the fees are commensurate with the value and that the incentives are in alignment? Well, let's talk about that. The first question we have to ask ourselves, George, is how are the fees assessed? And are these cost containment services, all those things we just looked at, are they actually containing cost or are they increasing cost? Now, how's that for a paradox or a dilemma? We have cost containment services that are not only not containing cost, they're actually causing cost to go up. And there's some evidence that that's going on in our industry. So let's take this closer look here. Well, excuse me, I'm going the wrong direction. I'm all excited talking about this, George.
You're going fine. I mean, obviously, I have to play this back. I'm going to have to play it back about 10 times if you understand it, but keep going. You're doing fine.
So the big question to agents and their client employers, how are you going to know? How will you know whether cost containment services are containing costs or driving up cost? Well, here's some things we wanted to watch out for and negotiate in a fair and equitable way with all parties. First of all, medical management, bill review, network management is often done, George, on a percentage of savings basis. And I'm going to give you an example in just a minute. We discourage the use of percentage of savings, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Also, you may find that nurse case management is offered to carriers or TPAs on an outsourced basis, and they have what's called a wholesale-retail relationship. The TPA or the carrier will buy the nurse case management services on a wholesale basis at a wholesale rate, but charge the client a retail rate. Sometimes you'll also find that there's overrides, rebates, commissions, or flat-out management fees. We'll just say, you know what? We're going to have this company over here do the work on our behalf. We're going to outsource it to them, and they're going to pay us. You're going to pay them, and then they're going to pay us. Now, George, I think you could probably see where that could create some conflicts of interest. Now, I say these things because I think they should be discussed. I think they should be transparent. I think all the parties should come together and put all these issues out on the table. Right now, many of these arrangements are mired in a bunch of murkiness and swampiness, and there's just, a game that goes on where there's not a real clear understanding of how much is being spent, how much is getting paid, and I understand both sides. Both sides have a legitimate concern, and the CFOs and the risk managers may be beating up the carriers and TPAs over their fees and squeezing them on the fixed costs, so they feel that they have to open things up a little bit on the variable costs, the allocated loss adjustment expenses. Not going to go too far down that path today other than to say that is worthy of a big conversation. Everybody needs to put their cards out on the table and be very transparent. Same thing goes when we move over to the attorneys. Are we using attorneys way too much? Are we overutilizing them? Do we have maybe a little bit too much of a cozy relationship with one firm? Maybe because they bought you a nice dinner at. I'm not saying that they bought your services, but you develop friends, and that's part of business, and nothing wrong with having friendly business relationships. But occasionally those relationships could get a little bit too cozy, and we want to look at that. We want to make sure everybody's interests are protected. There's no conflict of interest, and always be on the lookout for sweetheart deals around any and all services here. So there's a lot of issues that are moving around here, and I'll just give you one example, George. In the interest of time, we cannot drill down on all of these. But let's look at bill review. Bills have to be reviewed. A bill comes into a carrier or TPA. It is never the charges that have been agreed upon by contractor fee schedule. And that's for everybody. That's not unusual. So let's say that a $500 doctor bill comes in, but the fee schedule or the agreed upon amount was $100. So the managed care organization, the third-party administrator, the TPA, they plug the bill into a computer software program, and it says, well, we're really only going to cut you a check for $160. So we've got, approximately, we got about a $400 savings between the, I messed that up, George. The fee schedule is $100, the doctor bill is $500, the savings is $400.
Okay.
So the bill review company is going to take 40% of the savings, which is quote unquote $400. The bill review company is going to get $160 for adjusting that bill. The doctor only got $100.
Oh, fascinating.
Now get this, George. This is what's going to blow your mind. The more times an employee goes to a doctor, the more you save.
Oh
Now
my God.
think about that. I mean, how crazy is that statement?
Backwards.
So doctors have been beat up over their fees. They tend to bring people back more and more times so that they can overcome that fee
Mm-hmm.
or they can overcome that reduced fee and get more revenue. Well, guess what? The bill review company makes more and more money, and then they send you a report and they say you saved $400 every time you went to the doctor. You went 10 times, you saved $4,000. Well, the truth of the matter is they probably only needed to go 3 times.
Got it.
This happens all day, every day, George. It happens all day, every day.
Wow.
Now, let's just add zeros to those numbers, okay? $5,000 medical bill. The fee schedule is $1,000. There's $4,000 in savings, and now the bill review company gets $1,600. And man, the more you get and the higher the cost, the more you save.
Something wrong with that.
Crazy, right?
Yeah.
There's something wrong with that. Something very much wrong with that. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done there, George, in negotiating fair and equitable, transparent claims administration contracts. Nobody should be out looking to gore somebody else's ox. Let's put all the cards on the table and let's be open and transparent, because we should have the best interest of the injured employee at heart, and we should be talking about how we're going to help them get well, and let's pay for outcomes, let's pay people fairly, but let's not have crazy things like the more overutilization you engage in, the more unnecessary care you get, the quote-unquote more you save. That's nonsensical. We need to stop that. And those conversations typically are not being had. That's why, again, there's opportunity for agents in this space. Mm-hmm. Those conversations are not being had. The knowledge around it is just not there, and the ability to negotiate something otherwise. Now, George, ultimately, we still have to have a well-run business to have all this work. Product and service can only take you so far. We still have to have a well-run business. We've been talking now for the past 20-plus minutes or so about what's at the lower, part of this slide, where the transfer of risk. But, we need to identify, analyze, and control the risks. We need to assess and reduce the risks. That has to do with business operations. That's separate and apart. That has little to nothing to do with insurance or claims administration contracts. That has to do with assessment and process. And again, there's this assumption that big companies already have that wired, or big agencies already have that wired. Some do, most don't. Most don't focus here at all. They focus on a deductible premium. They focus on spreadsheets. This is where if we're not handling the identification, analysis, reduction, and control of risk, what good is it to have the best large deductible program in the history of the world? We're going to get bad outcomes. So all three of these pieces go together. So you remember this? You remember this spreadsheet, which is the way most of this stuff is sold? What we're really going for is we want to use analytics first to determine if it even makes sense. We want to negotiate the best contract, especially around claims administration. And I could go on for a long time on that I'm restraining myself, George. And we have to make sure that employers have the best processes in place to prevent, reduce, and mitigate injuries.
Let me ask you something. Let me interrupt you just a minute, all right? I know this is what you're saying. There's room at the top. But how does the average agency out there, I mean, a lot of what you said to me is, of course, is going over my head because I'm not a workers' comp guy. But how's the average agency going to learn about these things? The analytics is not easy. The contract, where's the agent how's he going to find out about all this? Is this taught somewhere that I don't know about? Or no? Bad question.
Well, George, it probably is of no great surprise as to why I lay this out, because this is something that we do. And it's something that we're in the marketplace to train agents around large accounts. So certainly, and it takes many, many years to pull all these things together, because, to just get personal for a moment, I've never assumed I'm the smartest guy in the room, but I'm among the most curious. And when I stumble across things that I find to be odd, strange, or just like the more you use, the more you save nonsense, I get real interested in digging down into the weeds on that. And sometimes, when you're digging through that brush, you find some really ugly stuff. And ultimately, the employee gets lost in all of this. I'm not the only one in the country that understands that cost containment services are problematic right now, and that the injured employee oftentimes does not even get help by them.
Let me ask.
They're not actually getting the best care.
Do you go into if somebody has? If I were an agent out there and wherever it is, that's not important, and I see a account that's paying 100, and I just know and I feel that I'm uncomfortable with what somebody else is doing. Do you actually come in and work on an individual account for somebody?
We've done that. We typically like to engage in a relationship that has ongoing support for individual accounts, because it's usually more than a one-off type engagement. For example, one of the things that's really important for agents is that, in many ways it's simple. As we often say, it all starts with a conversation. Let's assume an agent has a relationship or can get in with a large account CFO. And up to this point has just never felt they had any reason to go talk to them about business. They might even be close personal friends, just felt like, that's not my space.
Right.
What if they were to be able to go in and have a conversation and say, can we talk about, how your process for your selection of professional services, the way in which you buy your insurance, the way in which you manage your risk? We'd be willing to have a conversation around that. Sure, Frank, go ahead. Well, can I ask you a few questions? I understand you're on a large deductible plan. Yeah, that's right. How did you make that decision? Did you have analytical support around a loss pick? How did you make a determination for your deductible amount? How did you make sure, what process are you going through to assess your collateral every year? What's your loss development factors look like? Are they trending in the right direction, the wrong direction? And what's your 3-year cash flow projection look like? Are you maybe headed into a freight train or headed into a wall down the road? Have you considered any of these things? No, not really. We just kind of, we renew every year at $250,000 per claim, and, we've been doing pretty good. I think we're doing pretty good. Well, when was the last time you assessed your claims administration contract to make sure that you, your companies, and your injured employees' incentives are in alignment with your insurance company or third-party administrator? Because can we both agree that if their incentive is to keep the claim going because they have a lot of fees every time, it's kind of like, claims administration fees, George, are kind of like divorce lawyers. They really don't want to resolve the issues because then all the fees stop getting paid. And when an injured employee gets well, God forbid, the fees stop.
Got it. That's fascinating.
So have you talked about that? Have you? And look, there are good people on both sides. Please understand that. There's good people on both sides. There's just a need. Who was that Supreme Court Justice, Brandeis, that said light is the greatest antiseptic? Turn the light on or disinfect it. Turn the light on. Let's talk about this stuff. Let's protect everybody. Let's protect all the stakeholders. Let's make sure the carrier's protected on the collateral. Let's make sure they're getting healthy fees, comfortable fees, profitable fees, so they can do a good job on claims and they're not having to cut staff, which is going to hurt employees worse. And let's make sure that we're not saving ourselves to death by having so much overutilization, and we're getting these savings report. It's like, we can save ourselves right into bankruptcy. And then finally, let's assess your processes. How have you set up your network relationships? How are you managing return to work? Have you trained your supervisors? On and on and on. There's, a whole bunch of things to assess to make sure that you're a good company operating in good processes. George, I can promise you this. The vast majority of accounts above $500,000 in work comp premium are looking at spreadsheets and picking deductibles by the seat of their pants and have no insider knowledge as to what's going on the claims administration side, and they haven't effectively addressed their business processes. And that's where the agents have an extraordinary opportunity. They just have to dump the erroneous assumptions, and if they have to take it on faith for a while, understand there are huge opportunities at the top of this market.
That's a beautiful, beautiful presentation. I really think there's going to be a lot of people not going to understand what you said, kind of like me. I mean, you're way ahead of me, but I think a whole lot of agents, all of a sudden, the light's going to dawn and say, oh, my golly, I never really thought of that. And what I found out, I mean, talking to you, Frank, from the last few times, the complexities of this are really, really, really complex, if that's the word. They really are.
There are there are a lot of complexities, but if agents will take one thing away from this presentation, George, in that maybe some of the details that I went through they don't quite have their arms around, or maybe it
Right.
went by them a little bit. But what I hope they'll take away is this: kick those assumptions to the curb. There's a place for you in large accounts, and in many respects, there's less competition in the large accounts because most agents don't go there.
Well, that's a great message. I'm so glad you did it. I know that you communicate like crazy. Your assistant is a wonderful communicator. I work with her quite a lot, and I know you will. So I just want to thank you for sharing all this with us, and hope that if any of you have any questions, or if you have any needs, or if you have a great big account you want to get, and you want the pro to be with you, Frank's the guy. Frank, again, I thank you very much, and I look forward to our next conversation. And for the rest of you, I'll see you again next Monday morning.